everyone, and welcome back to another Victober video. And today I have a very exciting video. I am going to be interviewing Dr. Kristen Pond from Baylor University and just talk about Victorian literature, some of the research that she has done, and kind of what it's like to teach Victorian literature to students. And just thank you, Kristen, for being willing to take the time to do this.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So then at Baylor, you teach English and kind of what are the different hats that you wear?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the classes I teach are in Victorian literature, but I do also teach some in the 18th century. If you're interested in the novel, it kind of makes sense to go backwards because the novel, as
Yes.
we know it, really gets developed in the 18th century. So I love kind of looking at the history of the novel. That's part of what I do too. But the novel at its best, I think, is really in the Victorian period. So that's most of where I teach. I also just recently took on the Margaret Root Brown Armstrong Browning Chair, which is a really long name. But it's a position with the Armstrong Browning Library, which most people don't know about this library because it's very odd for it to be in Waco, Texas. But it is this collection of, it started as a collection of Robert and Elizabeth Browning, which are two really famous poets in the 19th century. It started as a collection of just everything related to them. So it has really random artifacts that belonged in their household, letters that they
Wow.
wrote, books that they've made comments in the margin, and then the collection has just grown to include lots of things by different writers in the 18th and 19th century. But people always laugh. They're like, why is this in Waco, Texas? But it really just started because there was Dr. Armstrong, an English professor, loved the Brownings, and it was like his private collection, and it just kept growing big, so big that he needed an actual building for it. And this building itself is beautiful. It's like a museum, actually.
Oh,
So anyways, I kind of have a role there with sort of outreach and developing some of their materials and things like that. So that's really, really fun.
wow. Yeah, I just actually last night finished my first time reading through Aurora Leigh.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Blew my mind. Just the language is so unbelievably rich. And I was planning on reading one book a month. But then once I got to book seven, things are really happening. And
Yeah.
I just had to keep reading.
Yeah. It's
Um,
it's funny to think of a poem having such a like enthralling story to it.
yes,
Yeah.
it is. It is. The anecdote that I love about Robert Browning that Elizabeth Gaskell in her letters included was that she was not very impressed with him when she met him because he fell asleep while she was talking to him.
That's hilarious. And Robert Browning actually did not have a great reception during his lifetime. It was really Elizabeth that was the more famous one. She
Really?
almost became poet laureate. Tennyson beat her out, but so Elizabeth was a more well-known one, and people thought Robert Browning's poetry was just too difficult and too weird. Um,
Wow.
so I think that's sort of funny because then it flipped,
Yes.
of course, in the 20th century. Robert became the main one.
Yes.
Now they're kind of equally famous, but it's kind of funny what happens to your reputation.
It is. It really is because there are some people who enjoy fame in their lifetime. George Eliot, I don't know if she enjoyed it, but she kind of was able to earn a living from her writing. And then others like Jane Austen, it was kind of very, slowly creeping towards actually kind of gaining an income from it. So I guess I would love to know what your first introduction to Victorian literature was.
Yeah. So I kind of automatically went back to high school because I think that's where a lot of people first encounter it. And it took me a long time of thinking about that. And I realized I'm almost positive it was Dickens' Hard Times. But the fact that I had to really think about it makes me realize what I already kind of feel is true, which that high school is not the place to read Victorian literature. And when I get students in my class that was their first and only introduction to Victorian literature, I kind of inwardly moan because it's usually never a great positive experience. And so even as someone today who loves the Victorian period, loves reading it, I have no memory of like falling in love with it as a high schooler. It really was once I got in college as an undergrad and started being exposed to more Victorian literature that I really, really liked it. George Eliot, as we were just talking about, was really the reason why I decided, okay, if I'm going to go on to graduate work and I'm going to specialize in something, I'm going to do it in the Victorian period, because I love George Eliot's novels, and I had a sense that she probably had, you know, a whole crew of authors and writers around her who were doing similar things, which is true. But she was really the one that first kind of cinched it for me that the Victorian period was the period I loved the most.
Oh, do you remember the first book that you loved by her?
Yeah, it was Middlemarch, which
Oh,
is still my favorite. I have grown to love almost everything that she has written, but Middlemarch was really the one. It's like, to me, it's the Victorian version of like the angsty teen novel. If you're sort of
yes.
thinking about Dorothea and all of her sort of striving and failing. And so when I read it as an undergrad in college, it just really resonated with sort of that own period in my life where I'm like striving to figure out who I am. And I feel like nothing's working out like I had plotted it to, and I'm, you know, misunderstood and no one. So, you know, again, I think it's, if I told a teenager that today and they read that book, they would think, what do you mean an angsty teen novel? But I think there really are strong echoes of that in that book. So
Yes.
I really appreciated it at the time of my life and when I read it.
Yeah, and it really is seeing the things that you think are wrong in the world and just how difficult it is to actually execute kind of improving things.
Yeah, yeah.
Once, laying the groundwork for that is a lot more challenging than kind of your ideals.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that is what I love about so many Victorian novels, is that they kind of have this like deeply tragic view of what you just described. Like the world is broken, and individuals are trying to fix it, but they're constantly kind of falling short. But it's not dystopian. So even though it has this tragic view, there's still this like deep undercurrent of hope that our
Yes.
small little acts can really make a difference. And I think that's what I love. So like as you get to the end of the 19th century, kind of moving into the World War I era, it's very dystopian, right? Like that hope is sort of gone. And so I have trouble with that part of the 19th century. And the earlier 18th century can still feel a little idyllic, like there's not quite this nod to the brokenness of the world. So I think that the Victorian period hits a sweet spot for me of sort of acknowledging the brokenness and the tragic view of the world, but still having this hope that it's going to be okay and we as individuals can do something about it.
Yes, and there is this real kind of nihilistic tendency then in more modern literature, and
Yeah,
it's kind of like, well, what's the point of doing good things if the world
yeah,
is broken?
yeah,
And I just really resonate with that in Victorian literature. And I think it inspires me in my mundane tasks that I do in the day to day. Like, this is a way of bringing life into the day. And yeah, it's something that is, Victorian literature is just such a dream because it's these very well written novels, but they have themes that I just think are, what do I want to say? Just classic. There's evergreen is maybe the term I'm thinking of.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yes. So then I was going to ask the first Victorian novel you loved, and so was that Middlemarch?
It was, at least that I remember, and I think that's probably important because the one you remember has got to be the most important, right?
Yes.
So Middlemarch did it. You know, George Eliot has another one that's a close second favorite of mine, which is Mill on the Floss. It's more about a sibling relationship, which is another kind of interesting and I think also very resonant aspect of that particular novel. But similarly has that sort of very tragic view of life. You know, poor Maggie is sort of trapped in these social norms that don't work for her, and she tries so hard to fit in, but doesn't, and we're not really rooting for her to, because that's not who she is.
Yes.
And the ending of that novel is really interesting. It's much less realistic than Middlemarch. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but people love to debate the ending because it sort of seems like an epic, or this sort of yeah, I guess unrealistic way of kind of resolving how is Maggie going to fit in the world. And so that's a really interesting part of that novel for me too.
Yeah, and George Eliot is so good at building empathy for Maggie, which it's you want to pull your hair out sometimes in the scenes with the different family members and her terrible brother. Um, and it's one of those books. It's interesting that I really didn't like it the first time I read it, And then last year I reread it and I disliked it a lot less. And now a year later, I'm like, yeah, I'll definitely try it again. So it keeps like calling to me and wanting me to kind of revisit it.
Yes. And it's interesting that you mentioned Tom and not liking her brother. I just sort of taught this novel over the summer, and we had discussions about how, I think, yes, it's 100% clear that Tom is not the most upstanding character. He doesn't treat Maggie well, and our sympathies are clearly with Maggie, which makes us frustrated with Tom. But there are some really key passages where I think Eliot also wants us to recognize that Tom, in similar ways to Maggie, is really bound by the social structures he's supposed to inhabit. There's all this pressure put on him by his family to sort of live up to his father's expectations. And then something happens with his father, which I won't necessarily mention, but it puts more pressure on Tom. And so to sort of think about how he often like lashes out at Maggie, I sort of see that as a repercussion of this like boiling pressure he's always under. And then it just
Wow.
erupts because he can't handle it. And unfortunately, Maggie is the recipient of that often. I think if you're an older sibling too, which I am, you can kind of relate to his, in their early childhood, you can relate to his frustrations because Maggie is always messing up his stuff and he's just like constantly irritated with her. I think their dynamic gets worse as they get older, right? And Tom becomes even less sympathetic. But those early years, I think, are really interesting where we're very quick to dismiss Tom. But I think Eliot
Yes.
actually makes him a rather complex character. And it's interesting to me that we dismiss him. But I do think it has to do with some things that he does to Maggie
Yes.
later in the novel. So
Wow, this is really good food for thought. And the next time I read it, I'll be thinking about that. And it's also funny, I feel very seen. I am a younger sibling. So I'm a middle sibling. And
yeah.
so it's just that, the type A tendency of the older sibling. It's a theme that reigns in literature even. Um,
Yes.
but it is true. I have thought, constantly messing up the stuff. That is pesky younger siblings. They're great at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then have you found kind of in the literature, the writing on Victorian literature that you've read, or interacting with students, do you think there are some common misconceptions out there about Victorian literature?
You know, I think if we're talking about kind of a general mass audience, or even someone who maybe has never even read Victorian literature, but just thinks of the Victorian period, I think the go-to stereotype is sort of like really uptight and stuffy and boring, the like sitting around in a parlor room. And that is a really interesting stereotype that has gotten perpetuated. In some ways, I think it is based out of the idea that there were some very specific and a lot of social rules, and it
Mhm.
was important to Victorians that they follow those rules because there was so much emphasis on class and status, and the way that you signaled kind of your identity and where you belong in society is by following these rules or not following them. So there may be some of that stereotype may come out of the sense that they're sort of like a rule bound
Mhm.
society. But I think there are some, and if we're thinking specifically about the literature, there are some crazy plots out there, especially if you're thinking about sensation fiction. There are some wildly psychologically scary, complex characters. They don't write overtly about sex in the same way that we do today, but there's so much like undertone of
Yes.
that, and just like these passions that sometimes erupt in crazy ways, but also just that are constantly like boiling beneath the surface that give the writing this just like really intense nature.
Mhm.
So I think the stereotypes don't hold up very well once you start actually reading the literature. Um,
Yes.
the other problem is that it is long, especially if you're reading novels.
Yes.
And it's slow. Even though you do have these novels with kind of crazy plots, they unravel so slow until like the last, 30 pages, and then it goes crazy. And I just think, it's hard for us today. Our culture is so fast paced and
Mhm.
we're used to sort of the sound bite of information. So the idea of reading a 500 page book about anything feels impossible to us. So there's also that working against Victorian literature, that you have to sort of, I think, retrain yourself to just go slow. I kind of think about the slow food movement that has emerged over the
Yes.
last few decades, and there needs to be like a slow reading movement or something where
Yes.
you just have to sit with it for a while, or you just need to acknowledge it's going to take me 3 months to read this book. I'm, thinking about how literature was serialized in the 19th century is also kind of an interesting concept for the sort of slow reading. But so those are
Yes.
probably the things that work against people's perception of Victorian literature.
Yeah. And I really like there's an app called Serial Reader
Yeah,
that will deliver classic literature to you in daily installments.
yeah, that's great.
And hopefully making it seem more doable. But yeah, I do think that the length does seem to be
Yeah.
a big obstacle, especially when it's written in Victorian dialect. Um, so you have to, yeah, just be patient. And there's no timeline on how quickly you have to get through a novel to call yourself a reader. Like
Yeah.
there's just whatever works for you and makes the novel come alive to you.
I decided in one a sophomore level undergraduate course to teach Vanity Fair, which is a very long novel by Thackeray.
Yes.
But we it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, and we talked about it every Monday through the entire semester. So they had all 14 weeks to read the novel.
Wow.
They read a few, chapters each week. And there's some pitfalls to that in terms of like keeping the story in your head. It feels kind of broken up, but also it was an interesting way for them to actually get through a 500-page novel. It just gave them all semester, and we were able to talk about reading practices and what does it mean to extend our understanding of the plot and the characters when you sort of leave it for a few days and come back to it, or you only read a couple chapters at a time. And so that was sort of an interesting experiment.
And were there very spirited discussions about Becky Sharp?
There were, and that is the other thing that I have found, is that when I teach Victorian novels to undergraduates, and I'm also picking ones that have these like really good relationships in them, but they have very strong feelings about what's happening in the novel, which I think just shows that what 19th century authors were writing about is the human condition, right? And it's still so pertinent to how we feel today. So even though it's in a different social context, the emotions are the same. And yeah, students get really riled up about them. So
Yes, that is so funny. Like, okay, we're doing things right if this is how things are going.
yeah, that's right.
So then you've kind of touched on the different things about Victorian literature that you like, but one thing I was going to ask is, what do you find keeps pulling you back to Victorian literature? This is all stuff that has been published over 100 years ago. And kind of what do you find about it that feels fresh?
Yeah. Maybe I'll touch on one aspect of that we haven't brought up as much, and then can circle back to some of the concepts we've already covered. But I think these authors, because sort of social rules are so important, but at the same time, what I find fascinating about the Victorian period is things were changing so fast and so much that they were having to sort of rewrite the script. And so in terms of especially categories like class and gender, these writers were really grappling with, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a gentleman? Class mobility was increasing. So, these formerly middle-class characters were kind of edging their way into the upper class. So what does class even mean anymore? And how do I signal my status? And so I like what I think is kind of an overt kind of fighting with and grappling with these categories that were sort of very traditionally part of society and just aren't working anymore. And so, you can think about it from sort of that feminist perspective of, this is the period out of which comes the sort of idea of, hey, women should get the vote. What does it mean for a woman to work or have a career? The idea of that sort of angel in the house, the domestic, hearth that was so protected and sanctified in the Victorian period. on one extreme, right? Like the reason why that is, I think, an image that we go to is because they were trying to hold on to it so tightly because it was slipping away. And so they were trying to figure out what does that mean? And so I do come back to it because I think there is so much about that resonates with our own society in terms of that like fast-paced changing social norms. And when your society is doing that and you're trying to figure out as an individual, where do I fit in that, that's a really tough place to be. And so I think Victorian novels offer a really fascinating way of just watching how the characters in the fiction, right, are kind of grappling with that. And I really admire, and it's that admiration maybe that draws me back a lot to Victorian novels. I admire the way that authors don't shy away from addressing it, and also don't shy away from critiquing it. So that's kind of one element that really impresses me about Victorian literature.
Yeah, it really is so resonant and so much of the literature. And even though, it's fictional characters that are speaking, but they're speaking kind of the thoughts that were in society in general from different parties.
Yeah. There's that famous, rant that Jane Eyre makes that I think is maybe one of the most famous about, basically saying women are just like men. They have these desires and they want to go out. I mean, it's a very racy passage for Victorian literature. Most aren't quite that overt. And the fact, that Jane is doing it while she's traipsing up and down the sort of third story is, I think, important for thinking about sort of space and psychology. And so it is this sort of moment where Jane, I think, sort of breaks out of her normal mode of I'm trying really hard to do what I'm supposed to do. And it's like she just can't take it anymore, and she's got to tell somebody about like, this is crazy. Why are we forced into these roles that I don't want to be in? And I think that is kind of a mantra actually that I see over and over and over in Victorian novels is why are we forced into these roles and what are alternatives? And so the characters, Bildun's Roman, if you want, is often trying to figure out what their role is. And often the end of the novel kind of sticks them back in whatever the traditional role is. So the endings of Victorian novels can sometimes feel very boring and mundane and closed and traditional, but sort of like what happens in the middle can be really interesting. So
Yes, yeah, they do often get tied up with a nice little bow.
yes.
So then are there any kind of is there a regular classic that your students tend to love?
I do often teach Jane Eyre because it is such a great it's organized really well in terms of the plot structure. And then, they love to debate Jane and her love of Rochester. So that one teaches really, really well. I do often teach Lady Audley's Secret, which is a sensation fiction. And it's a good one too it's a little bit harder to get like really attached to the characters because there's not any particularly super admirable characters in that one. But it does such a great job of sort of showing, the way that individuals get sort of warped by these social categories and roles that they're expected to be in. And it's a mystery story. So students I think they're surprised that they don't guess the mystery. Like I think they think Victorian novels are simple enough that they'll get it. But there's multiple secrets that get revealed. So I love the title Lady Audley's Secret because and again, I don't want to spoil it, but I think like the main secret is actually not Lady Audley's secret, it's someone else's secret. And that just like comes out of left field. And so I think, again, it's nice to sort of emphasize this is complex literature and they can surprise you, even the 21st century reader.
Yes. Yeah, it's funny to be shocked by such an old book. And I do feel that Jane Eyre is spoiled for so many people. It's just in the cultural, people will say different phrases that are referencing spoilers in it. And I just think, please, like, let people be surprised by Jane Eyre. Let them come to it not knowing.
Yeah. Well, it's just like that line that's so famous, which I don't know if you want me to say it or not, but it's like it kind of tells what happens at the end, but it's like this line that gets driven around all the time.
Yes. Although sometimes people hear those lines and they don't connect it with that. Then they'll go, oh, after they.
Yeah, that's where that line comes from. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Frankenstein is another one, which is not Victorian literature, but it's certainly an important precursor to. But that's another one that people kind of think they know the story because it's just everywhere in culture. But the
yes,
actual original novel is so different, and students are really enjoy that novel a lot too.
yes. And they discover that it's the monster, not Frankenstein.
Right. But you know, that conflation happened almost right away.
Yes.
So I think that's fascinating too, that I think Shelley kind of wrote it for that conflation to happen. So
That was interesting because I thought, oh, that's modern readers. That's what we've done. But then in Elizabeth Gaskell's letter, she immediately
yeah,
was
yeah,
referring to that character as Frankenstein,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
which was fascinating to me. Now, one that I feel kind of the cat is pretty much out of the bag is Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Good.
that's one that I do feel as a modern reader, I will never quite get as much out of it as the contemporary audience.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
the writing is, sterling, but it's just that shock will never be there.
You know, there's have you read I'm trying to remember the title now. Mary O'Reilly, I think might be what it's called. There's a modern retake on well, I shouldn't say a retake. It's written from the perspective of Jekyll's servant, his housemaid, essentially. It is really
Ooh,
fascinating. It's super short. But I taught a retellings course where we read like the 19th century novel and then a modern retelling of it. And that was one of my favorites. Yeah.
oh, I will definitely be looking that up because especially this season, and I'm trying to kind of before Victober and not actually just dive fully in with the Victorian literature and make Victober even
Yeah.
more exciting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll be looking that up.
That one's a great one. My other favorite one from that course was Nellie Dean, which you may have come across. It's
I have heard so many good things about it, but I have not yet read it.
it is really really good. So
Okay.
it's Allison Case who wrote it is brilliant, and it's a little bit longer, but it definitely again it's from the perspective of, well, Nellie Dean, the servant who like
Mhm.
has such a small role at the beginning, but she becomes really integral to the story. So in ways that
Wow.
I'm not sure Emily Bronte would have liked, but it's super interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of these retellings, you don't know what the author would think, but I love this one story about when Emily and Charlotte went to Brussels to be they were at a school,
Yeah.
and Charlotte said to Emily basically like, "Do you think you could try to dress more fashionably? Is that a thing you could try to do?" And Emily said, "I wish to be as God made me."
Sometimes I think having Charlotte as an older sister must have been the worst thing ever, but
No, after reading a biography of the Brontes, I came out being like, I would not be friends with Charlotte. Like, she wrote some amazing books, but I'm content just to read the literature.
yes, yeah.
So then I was very intrigued when you said, when we were planning for this, that recently you had done some research on the ethics of sympathy in Victorian literature, which kind of just blew my mind thinking about that. So could you sort of unpack some of that?
Yeah, so it may be strange to first think that sympathy would ever be unethical. But that is sort of the pitch that has been made in the last, I would say, couple of decades now. So this is a slightly older conversation, but it's still kind of happening. And the problem sometimes that can happen with sympathy is that it assumes that I know or understand what the other person is going through, or that I know or understand that person's sort of subject position. So no matter how, so it kind of erases difference is the unethical concern, is the concern about the unethics of sympathy. And so some people who study Victorian literature felt like Victorian novels were really bad at this particular problem of sympathy because they assume that we can know other people's experience, essentially. You
Hmm.
think about sort of the omniscient narrator, which is a really popular form of the narrator in the 19th. You sort of either have a first person narrator, right? Or you have this like, in fact, this is what some people critique Eliot for, is this sort of godlike narrator who knows everything, right?
Yes.
Um, and so what people do now that study Victorian literature, they're trying to find ways of understanding that maybe Victorian authors had a more complex understanding of sympathy. So I guess if we think about the trajectory, it was like, oh, Victorian literature is really concerned with ethics, and their big ethical move is to create sympathy, right? So their whole moral point of their art is to help the reader sympathize with people who aren't like them. And that seemed really good. So like that's where it started. And then the pendulum kind of swings to this, oh, wait a minute, that's actually not a great ethical move, because then it means someone who is of a different class or a different race or disempowered in some way that I am not, right? Then it just assumes that I understand them. And so my identity sort of takes over theirs, and it erases any important distinction. So then it was sort of, the pendulum was way over here, and it was like, oh, Victorian literature is bad. And then people started saying, well, wait a second, is it that simplistic? Like, is that really what Victorian writers are saying? So more recently, there's sort of a movement to write about and to understand the complexities of Victorian sympathy. And this is the part that really interested me, because it helped me identify how often Victorian writers are actually creating these really difficult to like characters and then sort of challenging us to like them anyways. And I use that word like because I think it's, in order to sympathize with someone, you sort of have to reach kind of some level of understanding or liking them. And that's where it gets murky in terms of the ethics of sympathy, like how much of that is okay and how much of it isn't. So for example, two like quick characters that come to mind, Charlotte Bronte's, not her Jane Eyre, but her other novel, Villette, which I really like. The main character in that novel, Lucy Snow, and it is a first person narrator, is actually quite unlikable. And in fact, she lies directly to the reader several times. And so I'm fascinated with the fact that Charlotte Bronte created this main character who actually could care less about the reader, especially when this author also wrote Jane Eyre, and Jane is like, oh, reader, please, please love me. I want you to, it's important that you like me, and Lucy is basically like giving the reader the middle finger and like, I don't care what you think about me. She's very caustic, in her responses to characters within the novel. She does weird things. But ultimately, because she's the main character and she's the narrator, our instincts as readers is to want to like her and to feel sorry for her and to be on her side. And so that's this tension that Charlotte Bronte, I think, is playing with and challenging our sympathetic abilities to maybe not have to be based in understanding or liking, but more acknowledgement. So I think that word acknowledgement can be kind of important. And then the other character that kind of reminds me of this move that Victorian authors often make is George Eliot's Silas Marner, which is actually a short novel, which is surprising to me. But she begins the novel by describing Silas as a weaver, and she describes weavers in general from the perspective of the 19th century, which is they're an alien race. She uses those words, and the whole first couple chapters of that novel are explaining how much of an outsider Silas is. And the information that the narrator gives us about him doesn't really do anything to increase our understanding or increase his likability. It just keeps creating this greater and greater distance. And yet again, it's clear throughout the novel that we're being asked to kind of acknowledge Silas's tragedies and acknowledge him as a human being. And so I think that those kinds of characters, it seems so clear to me that the rhetorical effect is to create distance from the reader, but still require the reader to be able to extend these feelings that we might call sympathy or acknowledgement or hospitality or welcome is another, I think, kind of interesting phrase to think about.
Wow. I'm going to be really thinking about this, and that is such a different experience in Jane Eyre versus Silas Marner. Actually, and Silas Marner is the Eliot that I connected with the least. So it's definitely worth returning to.
Well, and she told Blackwood, her publisher, like, I don't think anyone's going to like the story. But it was so important for Eliot to write that she stopped writing Romola, which was supposed to be like her big epic, novel that was going to impress everyone. She was like, I have to write this novel. It was also about the same time that she wrote that novella or short story, The Lifted Veil, which was about a man who suddenly has the sort of mystical ability to read everyone's thoughts, which is sort of like the epitome of sympathy, right? Like the ability to truly understand everyone because you know exactly what they're thinking. And Eliot cast this as a horrifying and terrible experience. So the idea that we would be able to comprehend everybody down to the minutia of what they're thinking is actually a terrible thing. Like having some distance and some inability to comprehend fully the people around you is actually important. So I think that's kind of what's going on in Silas Marner. So even though she worried people wouldn't like the story, it seemed like an ethical or sort of morally important story for her to put in front of her readers.
And then I'm thinking another aspect would be the more sensational kind of plot line where there's someone that you think you know them, you think you have this sympathy with them, and then out come these secrets.
Yeah.
Or in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Alec Derbyfield, he seems respectable. He has a respectable name, he's of a respectable household, and he's anything but.
Yeah. And that, you've pointed to, I think, another kind of thread or theme that runs through a lot of this Victorian literature, which is sort of ousting the idea that appearances, the outside, right, is readable, interpretable, knowable, when in fact it's not, right? So that's something that really interests Victorians too. This is also the period where you've got empirical science coming out. And so I think a lot of times Victorian authors are kind of writing against this idea that we can discover and know everything through our senses, that there's actually things that we can't know and our senses can lead us astray. And so they're kind of writing a different narrative to that scientific one that's emerging at the same time.
Yeah, that's so poignant or so timely, because in the last section of Aurora Leigh that I was reading, she talks about the natural and the spiritual and how it's like two halves of an apple. And people try to just think about the spiritual or just think about the natural. And I think that's kind of also, like, it makes me think of the transcendentalist movement, which is just really just idolizing nature. But I think it's kind of this idea of, knowing that's when you can know your truest self, is through that lens. So then you also had talked about the figure of the stranger in Victorian literature, which actually for my prompt this year for Victober, each of the hosts pick a different prompt. They're optional, but if people want them, and mine was read something with a stranger or an outsider in it. People are spoiled for choice. There's lots of options there. So kind of what was the angle you had on it and some of the stuff you observed?
Yeah, so I was kind of interested in this idea of, it is connected a little bit to what we were just talking about, this idea of knowing, right? And strangers kind of represent this strange moment of, I don't know this person. And what is that experience like of not knowing someone? So engaging or encountering them and not knowing them. And I realize most often we think about that in negative terms, right? Strangers are dangerous. Don't talk to strangers. We hear that when we were little. And certainly that is an important part of thinking about encountering strangers. And it is everywhere in the literature, in the 19th century as well. They're often plot devices that use this idea of the scary stranger. And so I think I set out to just see, is there another representation of the stranger and encountering the stranger in Victorian literature? Or is it always this sort of dangerous, scary, stay away from thing? And I did find that there's this other idea, and I'm going to use the word enchantment or wonder, might be another word to think about, where the moment at which you encounter a stranger, before you really know much more than just sort of the face of them. They're in front of you, or, you know, that there's so much potential in that
Mm.
moment. There's so much possibility, so much is unscripted. And just as that person is a stranger to you, you are a stranger to them. And so your own identity is sort of malleable, and it's not set in the same way that it is when you're around your family or, you know, at work. And so the potential and possibility, I think, filled Victorians with wonder. And so there is this other aspect of strangers that represent this possibility and hope for transformation and for change. And so that is kind of the thread that I explored the most. It does always bump up against the strangers in the more negative sense. And sometimes that original hopefulness does become, oh, I misjudged that, this is actually a bad stranger, right? So it's always can slide that way, which is another reason why enchantment is a good way of describing that encounter, because similarly enchantment can quickly become sort of disenchantment, or we might think of being entrapped or tricked, right? So there's that notion of enchantment versus the enchantment that is more about like wonder and just awe and kind of not knowing and what's appealing about that. So I liked that kind of slippery slope, if we want to say, of that notion. So that's kind of what the element of stranger that I was exploring.
Yes. So then can you think of any off the top of your head kind of novels that feature that the wonder and enchantment?
Yeah, let's see. What well, so can I give an example from a short story?
Of course.
So Charles Dickens wrote this Christmas number called Mugby Junction, which most people know his Christmas number, A Christmas Carol, but he
Yes.
wrote these all the time, right? Mugby Junction is really fascinating. It's 8 stories, and he wrote 4 of them, and authors you've never heard of wrote the other 4. But they all take place around the railway. And so part of what I'm interested
Ah.
in thinking about with strangers are the spaces that we associate with strangers. And so for the Victorians, the railway was completely new. The idea
Mm.
that you would sit beside a stranger and, like, what are you supposed to do? Do you talk to them? Do you not? You know, that's something we don't think about today. We don't have that strange pressure, but that was a new space for them to figure out, how do I encounter and engage with these strangers? So anyways, Mugby Junction is different stories that take place like in the waiting room at a train station,
Mm.
or in the railway carriage, or different spaces. But there is the opening story features this character, Jackson, who is in very interesting ways emptied of his identity. He quit his job, which was his sole identity, as Dickens characters often are. And he's called the gentleman for nowhere by people at the railway station,
Mm.
because he shows up every day and he can't figure out where to go. So he has no name, no identity, no purpose in life. And that's so clearly kind of how Dickens wants us to understand how he starts this story. And he's
Mm.
walking around the town that is at the train station, Mugby Junction, and he sees this girl in the window, and he can't figure out what she's doing. Her head looks like it's kind of floating in midair, so it takes on this kind of magical notion. And
Mm.
he just keeps walking back and forth by her window like day after day. And finally, she's like, "Hey, do you want to come up? Like, you seem interested." And he goes up, and it turns out that she's paralyzed and can only lay
Wow.
down. And so what he was seeing was like her arms and her head, but below the window sill was the rest of her body. So it kind of starts this interaction. But I love the way that she was truly a stranger to him, and the fact that he literally knew nothing about her, didn't know her name, never really engaged with her other than to walk past her window. And they eventually started exchanging pleasantries like, "Hello, good day," you know. But then it transports to this moment where they actually start having a conversation.
Mm.
And they are so different from one another, right? I mean, she's young, she's a girl, she has a very different class background than this character. And he starts traveling on trains with the purpose of bringing her back stories. And so I love how this idea of story becomes this connecting device. And eventually Jackson decides to settle down in this town, and create a home there. And so he goes from being sort of having no identity, no home, no purpose, and then through the railway, right, kind of creates this connection with this complete stranger. And the encounters are often filled with wonder because she's so different from him that Jackson keeps reflecting on how does she have that perspective of the world? I just don't get that. And so I think he's intrigued by her. And again, there's some amount of distance that remains between them because they're so different. They can't quite be like family. It's not like a romantic connection. So I like that aspect of it too, that they sort of remain distant. They can only connect so much, but that connection becomes vital to Jackson understanding who he is. So that's probably like an example that people have never heard of, that story from Dickens, but it offers a way of showing that a particular space, and an encounter with a stranger creates wonder in someone, and then that wonder eventually cycles back to help that person understand something about themselves and their own identity. So that's kind of the cycle that I was really interested in.
That I haven't read Mugby Junction, but I do love the idea of a motif of having the same location and just seeing these different relationships and different stories based on that. One that I did think of is The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Young. Um,
Yeah.
and the figure of Guy, the family it's really interesting because some of the family, particularly Philip, before they've met him, has just decided, boy, this guy, his family legacy is besmirched. We need to have our guard up.
Yeah.
And there are other members of the family that are like, this is someone we can welcome into our family. And so it's interesting kind of the range that you see in that family. And then they all draw their own conclusions once they actually meet him and interact with him.
Yeah. I mean, one other way to think about this is actually in Jane Eyre. There are two really interesting moments where Jane becomes a sort of a stranger to herself. And they are moments where she hears her story told to her. And I don't think people pay attention to these scenes in the novel. So one of them, for example, is when after she sees that Thornfield Hall, I'm going to spoil this a little bit. After Thornfield Hall has been burnt, right? And if you're wondering what that's about, go read the novel.
Yes.
She goes to an inn and she pretends like she knows nothing about it. And she just said, "Hey, what's up with this like big country house that's been burned down?" So the innkeeper perceives her as a complete stranger and proceeds to tell her the story of Rochester and that house, including the governess that lived there and fell in love with him. And so she hears all about her own story. And what's so interesting about that is it's how others perceive her role in that story. And for the innkeeper, it's very negative. He does not like the governess. That was it. And so as readers, that's really interesting because we're near the very end of the novel and we are on Jane's side and we think everything she's done has been basically correct and right. We're like really sympathetic. And then it kind of brings you up short because you think, oh, not everyone perceives her story that way. What happens if she's not the storyteller? What if someone else is telling her story? And I think Jane has to go through that same kind of moment of hearing her own story as if it's not about her, and it makes her have to rethink her identity. So I have some really interesting ideas about how that affects what happens when she kind of goes back. So anyways, that's another way of sort of thinking about, how encountering a stranger makes you rethink sort of your own identity. And that can be both terrifying and exhilarating kind of at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and it's particularly, I feel like that instance with Jane Eyre is kind of like eavesdropping. And they say, you're gonna regret it. But I think I do feel also she's secure enough in her own identity that she's probably not thrilled that that's the idea they have about her, but it doesn't change what she thinks about herself.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, then is it possible for Romola with Tito when he's first arrived? He's this beautiful, beautiful man. And it takes an interest in Romola.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I think Eliot is the one, strangely, I didn't write much about Eliot in the book, but she's sort of like haunting it in the background. And I think she is the one that first made me think about whether strangers and that encounter with them is a more complex way of thinking about sympathy and what Victorian authors are asking us to do with sympathy. And Romola is sort of interesting too. Same with Daniel Deronda, whenever she sort of brings in sort of a non-English character or a setting, and that kind of complicates things in ways that I think Eliot means to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. It's sometimes I do feel I love her. She's one of my absolute favorites. But the ways that they happen upon the strangers can seem a bit contrived.
Yes.
Like how Mira meets her brother. It's because somebody happened to go into this store on a random day, and what do you know? It's your brother.
Yeah. 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 I know. That's a quandary in my mind of whether that makes Victorian novels more or less realistic, right? Because I think sometimes those coincidences really resonate because they happen in our life too.
Yes.
But they I think the problem is sometimes they seem so contrived to help the plot, right? Like that's when they start
Yes.
sliding into like, what?
Yes. Yeah. When Jane is wandering the moors and
Yeah.
then the household that
Oh, it's
she,
her cousin.
yes. What do you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So, but then sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and those, like you said, those kinds of things do happen, but they're very exceptional, and it seems kind of the ratio in which they occur in Victorian literature might be higher than they
Yes.
happen
Yeah.
in everyday life.
It's an interesting, and that's another thing that's really interesting about Victorian literature is how often it blends the exceptional with the ordinary, right? And that's a really fascinating kind of tension, I think, too.
Yes, yeah, maybe that is because I think if a 500 to 600 page novel was just the ordinary, I might get a little bored.
Yes.
Charlotte Mary Young, her books are a lot of the ordinary, but then there's a house fire,
Yeah.
or there's a plague, not a plague, but scarlet fever is rampant, something like that. And those things kind of you need something to kind of put some energy into the story
Yes.
to
Yeah.
propel it along.
Yeah.
But then little ones like Gaskell's Cranford, although there are some pretty eventful things that happen in that.
According to the people who live in the village, right? It's quite a
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And I love that Gaskell said that was the only one of her novels that she liked to read herself.
Yeah.
When she wasn't feeling well, she would read it. So I
Yeah.
think that's very
That is
charming.
a great one. Yeah.
Yes. So what is the formal title of your book with your research on the figure of the stranger or outsider?
Yeah, so it's Strangers and the Enchantment of Space in
Okay.
Victorian fiction. I have 1830 to 1865 as the
Okay.
time frame. And it's supposed to be out in October. I would love for people to read it and see what they think. It kind of has some big hitters in there, talk about Charlotte Bronte's in there and Dickens is in there, but then also some authors people have never heard of. I hope to kind of, introduce people to some new stories. And so
Yeah. Can I ask who one of those lesser known authors is?
sure. Charlotte Elizabeth Tonna, and she actually, this is probably a whole nother topic, but we often dismiss religious writers because we assume what they're writing about is sort of boring and mundane and too moralistic. So part of my argument for including her, and I include her alongside Harriet Martineau, who eventually claims herself an atheist and is like very scientific in her approaches. But I show how in their stories, Martineau and Tonna are actually sort of speaking about the same approach to the stranger or the same idea of sympathy. And I find it fascinating that they can come from these two different poles and sort of meet in this place, although they would not want to say they agree with one another. But
Wow.
so she, I think, writes some they're short stories or maybe novellas. You could maybe call them that. But I think they're very complex stories. The characters, they're not a Bronte or an Eliot character, but she is writing with a purpose. She's agitating for reform related to some sort of factory laws and the new poor law. So it is a little bit of that like fiction with a purpose. But even so, the kind of characters and the narrative techniques that she uses, I think, are really fascinating. And they're really tied to her religious beliefs. So I think it's interesting to look at how like her beliefs about sort of like grace, that has a lot to do with how she's constructing her narrative and like what she's asking of readers and the responsibility that her readers have for these strangers, in the fiction. So she's one who I think people have never heard of, and in hearing about her biography would probably dismiss her as nothing she wrote could possibly be interesting, and just sort of making a pitch for, let's give her a chance and see what she's doing. So
wow, yeah, we are in such a kind of a religious age, that there it can be that writing that off, but people should think of it as own voices,
yeah,
um,
yeah. And that was often how women were able to sort of have social permission to be social activists, right? Was that, I am, doing this because of my religious beliefs. And so therefore, almost like in that sort of missionary role, which has lots of problems, but in that sort of role, I'm like going to go out and fight for this. And that's, Tonna was editor of a magazine, and was able to kind of have a voice because she did it through this sort of alleyway of I'm writing in this sort of Christian publication, and that therefore makes it okay for me to be in the public as a woman. So I also find that really fascinating, that if we kind of write off these women who use that religious avenue to get into the public domain, that we're missing their voices, and they were very involved in these public debates, but they often felt like they had to do it kind of through the church.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course that makes me think of Charlotte Young, who it was only, later into my Victorian reading that I found her, but it's just been feels like a treasure hunt now going through her different novels.
I think Tonna would be a really interesting comparison for you to think about alongside Young. Yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah, I'm definitely going to look her up. So it's Charlotte, what is her full name?
Charlotte Elizabeth Tonna.
Okay.
And then I'll throw one other name out there for you, Felicia Skene.
Haven't heard of this one either.
Skene, and she actually wrote novels. You won't find novels by Tonna. She just wrote short fiction and lots of periodical essays. But Felicia Skene wrote novels. The Tutor's Ward is the one that I've read.
Okay.
But it's similarly, I have an article where I kind of compare some of what she wrote to George Eliot, actually, and I find her, again, it's hard for anyone to measure up to Eliot, but she's like, in that camp of having really complex characters and really interesting narrative techniques that I think, given Skene's association with the Oxford movement, people might just write her off. But I think, again, she's worth kind of looking at.
Wow. Well, I will link to Kristen's book down below. And this has just been so fascinating, and I'm off to Google these new authors. So thank you very much, Kristen, for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. This has been a delight.